Welcome back, dear listeners. And on Airwaves today, we have a very special guest. His name is Jeffrey Izzo. Okay. And for those who don't know him, he's the Director for Refugee and IDP Affairs at the U.S. Embassy here in Baghdad. So, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with us.
Oh, thank you, Brahim, for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sure. So, as you know, today is the 20th of June, and the world is celebrating the World Refugee Day. Okay. And before we delve into this topic, could you tell us about yourself and your position as a government official here in Baghdad?
It would be my pleasure. I have been a Foreign Service officer with the United States for 24 years now. I've worked in 7 countries, and my career is mostly focused on macroeconomic stability and also post-conflict stability. Incidentally, this is my second assignment here in Iraq. I was here in 2010 and 2011. For this current assignment, I am in charge of USG assistance to help Iraqi IDPs and also refugees. And the other half of my job is to monitor and deploy the U.S. refugee admissions program here in Iraq.
Okay. And what would you say the most challenging part about your job?
The most challenging part, I think, is really wanting to solve the problem of protracted displacement quickly to relieve the suffering of Iraqi families and give them a better chance, but not being able to do it as quick as we want to. It's heartbreaking. That's the biggest challenge.
Takes time.
Yes.
Okay.
It takes time.
So, as you know, today we are celebrating this day, like the World Refugee Day. So, can you please tell us about it and why it is important?
Absolutely, I would love to. This is World Refugee Day was designated by the United Nations, and the purpose of it is to highlight the plight and the resilience of refugees around the world. And so on this day, we honor and are mindful of the strength and courage of people who have been displaced from their homes, forced to leave their country due to conflict, persecution, and even natural disaster. Why is this important? Well, certainly there are many people in this world who face persecution and terror right in their home communities without fleeing their countries. And that's a terrible thing. And the U.S., along with many other countries, are focused on promoting human rights and bringing perpetrators of human rights violations to justice. But with refugees, there's an added dimension of misery because they've left behind all their resources and possessions, and more importantly, have lost their community. And with the loss of community, they're at risk of losing their cultural identities eventually.
True.
And so no matter where we are from on this planet, what our religious beliefs are, what our ethnicity is, human beings need to be part of a community. It's hardwired into our DNA. And so the intent of this day is to recognize this fundamental loss of community for refugees, a loss that greatly amplifies all of the other challenges that they may be facing in life.
Okay, that's great. And you see, when it comes to people who have left their homes, apparently some people confuse a refugee, an asylum seeker, and an IDP. So could you explain what the differences between these words are?
Certainly, I'd be happy to, and it's easy to confuse them. The terms themselves all have legally accepted definitions under international law. And so it was the UN 1951 Refugee Convention that established these definitions. And so the definition of refugee has 3 main elements. Number 1, it's a person who fled their country of origin. They crossed an international border. Number 2, they did so due to a well-founded fear of persecution due to their race, religion, national identity, member of a specific group, or even political beliefs. And the third element is that they can't go home for fear of this persecution. They'll be targeted, killed, tortured, etc. So that is a refugee, essentially someone who flees their country due to political unrest, persecution, and crosses an international border. Now, that term is a designation that's legal status designation that's given by the country where a refugee flees to, based on those criteria set forth in the convention. Now, until they are designated a refugee, they're what's called an asylum seeker. This is someone who fled their country and is hoping to be given refugee status, and but until then, we just refer to them as an asylum seeker. And lastly, internally displaced people or persons do not leave their country. That's the big difference. They don't cross an international border. But they're person or groups of people who have been forced or obliged to flee their home community or areas of habitual residence, in particular as a result or in order to avoid war, conflict, social upheaval, situations of generalized violence. So the key difference between refugee and internally displaced person is the internally displaced person does not leave their country of origin.
Okay, and I think Iraq is suffering from this. I think we have too many internally displaced people here. I think that's a major problem here in Iraq.
That's correct. It's still a major problem, but Iraq has made really good progress since at the end of the conflict with ISIS in 2017 or 2018, you had 6 million internally displaced people. Now, about 5 million have been resettled, which is a tremendous
That's
undertaking.
brilliant.
Yes. There's still about 1.2 million people that we consider living in protracted displacement. Only about 187,000 of those are actually in formal IDP camps, of which there are 25 in Iraq remaining. Another 70 or 80,000 are in informal communities. This is where they've just squatted in areas.
Okay.
And the rest are people we considered they're living in private homes, but they have no homes of their own, and we still consider them displaced from their original community.
Okay, that's fantastic. And what about refugees? So apparently, like we have, this World Refugee Day. So would you say that refugees are treated differently when it comes to, let's say, giving them rights and dealing with them when they arrive in a different country?
Yes. In general, in most countries, I'm not just talking about Iraq, refugees are treated differently. And why is that? Well, it all comes back to community, what I said before. Refugees are foreigners in a foreign country. They usually have no supporting community in the countries they flee to. They have no political power and rarely have even an advocate in that country's political or legal system. Now, additionally, refugees cost money, providing for all of their needs, food, clothing, and shelter. It can be expensive, and oftentimes you don't know for how long, for an indefinite period. All right, so that's a problem for any government to provide the needed resources due to domestic political resistance, right? And at the local level, host communities have concerns that they will have to compete with refugees for jobs and housing if they stay. And if the refugees are of different ethnicity or religion, well, then you have all those
Challenges.
social tensions
Yeah.
as well.
Okay.
So, incidentally, it's for all of these reasons is precisely why the United Nations instituted the 1951 Convention. It was to set out minimum accepted standards for the treatment of refugees by host nations willing to sign on to the convention. So the convention outlines these basic minimum treatment of refugees, including the right to housing, work and education while displaced, so they can lead a dignified and independent life.
Okay, that's great. And I did a little research, and apparently the U.S. government is playing a major role in supporting IDPs and refugees. Okay, so could you tell us about that?
Absolutely. Yes, we are playing a major role in Iraq and also globally, and we're proud to be able to help Iraq, finally recover from the conflict with ISIS. Just some numbers for you. Since 2014, we've provided over $3 billion U.S. dollars in humanitarian assistance to Iraq for refugees and internally displaced persons and rebuilding communities. For 2022, it was about 251 million U.S. dollars went to support 300,000 refugees in Iraq, and also the 1.2 million Iraqi IDPs. Some of that money, about 40 million of it, was actually to support Iraqi refugees in neighboring countries. So we're supporting the Iraqi refugees in neighboring countries and also the internally displaced Iraqis here.
That's very interesting. And this money, is it, let's say, for housing? Is it for their education, food? What do you like mainly focus on?
That's a really good question. It's all of the above. What it goes to is this. There's a standard packet of assistance that an IDP or refugee will need. Number one, shelter, right? And number two, food. So food assistance, shelter. It's usually in the form of tents, temporary shelter in a community. The water and sanitation of that community, providing potable water, sanitation, refuge removal, and also very important, what we call protection services. And these are caseworkers who will focus on gender-based violence, exploitation of women and children, and make sure, because refugees are much more vulnerable to these in the community. We also provide non-food items. These are kits that you'll need in your tent, like a heating plate, electrical cords, blankets, clothes, those things under the non-food. In some cases, health. We will fund primary health care facilities in these IDP or refugee camps. And in addition to that, we also will provide some assistance for cash assistance for livelihoods, so they can get back on their feet once they're reintegrated into a community and have a chance to provide for themselves and their families.
Okay, that's great. So basically, the essential needs.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, that's great. And I'm sure that you have met a lot of internally displaced people and refugees here in Iraq. So what would you say the biggest challenge that they face, apart from shelter?
Apart from shelter, good question. Yes, I have met a number of IDPs in Iraq, and aside from shelter, some of the bigger problems are number one, lack of civil documentation. When they fled their areas, maybe they lost their IDs, or maybe their IDs were confiscated from them by ISIS, etc. And so without these, it's hard to reintegrate. You can't register for social services, for social support. You can't register your child for school, for education. So civil documentation is a big factor here, a big challenge that IDPs need to overcome. Another one is inadequate nutrition and health care. As much as we try to provide for those things in the camps, it's not as good as what they can provide for themselves. And a lack of a livelihood. Many refugees in camps or IDPs in camps would love to reintegrate, but they have no prospects for employment. And this is aside from the house being destroyed. And so lack of livelihoods is a huge challenge as well. And then, of course, when we get down to it, there's local perceptions of the IDPs and the refugees. And in this case of Iraq, the perception is with many of them, they're associated with ISIS. And so it's hard to get local acceptance and approval of the community for them to reintegrate back into the community.
Okay, that's great. And so we talked about, the U.S. government's part. Okay, so what about Iraqis? We as Iraqis, how can we help the IDPs in the country? What can we do?
Good question. I think the biggest thing is acceptance. Fostering a country and a community that will accept and is trying to help these IDPs reintegrate. And then, political and financial support. You've got a democracy. You can lobby your government, your Council of Representatives, to ensure that the support is there for your Iraqi brothers and sisters to be able to become functioning members of the community again. And then there's also a list of humanitarian organizations that are accepting cash donations for disaster responses around the world. And that can be found at interaction.org.
Okay.
www.interaction.org. And then I think you can search by countries. There are many Iraqi NGOs, I think you'll find on that list, that are engaged in helping refugees and IDPs, and they always need assistance.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with us again. And we really hope to talk to you again. Thank you so much again.
It's been my pleasure, Brahim. Thank you very much for having me.